What is the biggest risk, do you think, to the United States of these meetings?
Well, there's several risks. Of course, the meetings could fail altogether, but I think the signals we're getting from Secretary Pompeo is, in fact, there has been progress with respect to the preliminary negotiations. We saw in the G7 summit that the president is willing to use theatrics. So it's possible that if something goes wrong in that first hour, that he could walk out or throw a tantrum. But I think in general, it looks to me like the preliminary negotiations have generated at least the possibility of a framework agreement of some sort.
Well, you mentioned theatrics, and we have two leaders here that are apparently both enjoy some theatrics on the world stage. What is the danger that, in fact, it'll all be theatrics and we won't get anything substantive out of this?
One of the things I'm going to be looking for is whether there's a joint statement of the parties or whether this is just handled through a press conference. Because if you have a joint statement, then you've committed on paper to some sequence of events, some steps that would ultimately lead to this goal of denuclearization. If you just have a press conference, then obviously there can fudge details. You'll get somewhat different statements by the two leaders. So that's one of the things I'm looking for sure.
How dangerous is the promise of a peace treaty when it could in fact boost the pressure on the U.S. to reduce its presence in East Asia?
That's a good question. We need to think about what the United States is actually willing to give the North Koreans. The North Koreans are not going to simply give away their nuclear weapons. Another way of thinking of it is, what's the bribe price here, really? And clearly, some assurances are going to have to be offered. But I think in terms of a sequence, you might get a declaration of an intent to replace the armistice. But I don't think the United States would actually sign a peace agreement with a nuclear North Korea. So that's something that would come down the line. Secretary Mattis said in his Shangri-La address a couple of weeks ago that the troop levels on the Korean Peninsula, that's an issue for the South Koreans and the U.S. to negotiate, not the North Koreans.
From the North Korean side, Kim Jong-un has a longer time horizon than his father did when he took power, Kim Jong-il, from Kim Il-sung. So does this change the calculation of the young North Korean leader when he's trying to stay in power for not 2 or 3 decades, but for 4 or 40 or 50 years?
One of the things we've seen from the Korean delegations over the whole course of negotiations going back to the early 90s is incredible patience. They do take a long view. On the other hand, the only reason I think Kim Jong-un came to the table is because the sanctions regime, both multilateral and bilateral from the United States, is starting to have some effect on the North Korean economy. I just can't come up with any other theory of the case. So that means that the ability to strike a good deal after Singapore, when the negotiations will take place, hinges on that sanctions regime remaining in place.
And therefore, what is the danger, finally, Professor, that in fact, if things appear to go particularly well, some of our allies, some of the people who are in the sanctions regime with us, may get a little weak in the knee? We saw that happen in Iraq, for example.
I certainly think that's probably the biggest risk. And the problem, I don't think, is South Korea, because we have a very good consultative relationship with them and the alliance. I think the problem is China. We've already seen a little bit of slippage in the sanctions regime. If Xi Jinping decides to give Kim Jong-un more running room on the economic front, it could slow the negotiations down.